it's funny, like when we talk about like repetition and consistency or lack of consistency in one's career. But like repetition, consistency, meeting like people's expectations, meeting colleagues' expectations. I feel like that is good groundwork, maybe good preamble to talk about governance and design systems and consistency in what we do. I hope people get points, like, I don't know, in heaven or something for like really good segues, because I want those. The segues that you don't see coming at you. But that is a lot of what Greg and I have been talking about since we started working together in Loupe Collective. And Greg, do you want to talk a little bit about how we came together and why?
Yeah. So at the end of my time with the company after Envision, I'm at the point where at the career where it's like, okay, I've done all these things. What do I want to do next? And I went on a quest to just have as many conversations with people that I've known over the last 2 decades or so. And in that time, it's kind of like, the Samurai 7 kind of story of like picking up all these people who are extraordinary in the work that they do, but are kind of working on their own. And in talking with folks like Margot, Brett Harned, Nick Hahn, found that we all had different areas of a larger story of the kind of work that we're really good at doing and that we enjoy doing, but that we had one common thread, which was we want to work together. We want to work together as smart people working with great clients and just helping people all along the way, no matter how we do that. And so in talking with each individual, I brought everybody together and said, hey, I think we ought to form a band. And so nobody said yes right away. It's kind of like, well, I don't know. I've been kind of doing my own thing for a while. But over the course of months, we had some very productive conversations, our own workshops, and kind of facilitated and kind of got through like, well, what we would want to do together. And the result is Loupe Collective, which is at the heart of it is work around systems thinking. We're all systems thinkers. Every problem that we look at, every challenge, we see the broader implications of not just fixing that one thing, but how this might affect the system, accordingly, and vice versa, how a system approach might, work to help in the problem or the situation or the team that we're working with. And so that's kind of why we're here, why we're together. Fun fact, I think Margot and I met at Confab, I want to say back in like 2012 or 2013, and I really got to know Margot briefly, but on one evening when we were singing karaoke at the Otter Bar in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So shout out to Minneapolis, UFTA. That's where Margot and I actually, got to know each other a little bit better and had a lot of fun.
There was another karaoke bar before that too.
The piano one, Nice
Polonaise, which I think has closed. But yeah, then at the Otter Bar, which I feel like a lot of content strategists are like, and then there was karaoke. But I think before there was karaoke, this idea though around like systems thinking, and I feel like that is I'm like hanging on this slide, I know, but I feel like this act of saying, but what else? Who else in the organization will my decisions or my recommendations affect? And where do we have to look deeper to inform those decisions or recommendations? I feel like that is at the heart of so much content strategy consulting, and maybe like the content strategy personality or the content strategy mindset. We're always asking, but what else? But who else? Who else do we need to bring into this conversation? Who else do we need to bring into this decision to ensure that it's socialized appropriately in the organization? That that we're not just kind of like throwing over these editorial style guidelines, but rather the right people are co-creating them and embracing them and all. So I feel like this idea of systems thinking is so much at the heart of content strategy. And I think that's a big reason why it's important for us to be focusing on also some of the big issues around design systems. And I guess having a seat at the table and figuring out what some of those issues are and what are the things that we need to include and address through design systems now at this kind of early stage in this part of the industry, so that it's baked in then throughout the process. And we pulled together just a few slides. Again, these are some of the other folks within Loupe Collective, Nick Hahn and Brett Harned, who also bring perspective from design and project management and how it kind of all needs to come together and how we need to communicate it all out. And in a lot of our work around design systems, we're kind of pulling on those evolving threads in the industry right now, how different people are thinking about it, how in some cases we're still describing it as largely visual components coming together in a largely visual semantic structure with largely visual tools describing it and describing how the elements all work together, but also saying like, there's a content side to this as well.
Can I just interject here for a second?
Yeah.
Go back to the slide before. So another thought here is that we're still very early stages of what design systems are, and even a design system for one company is likely going to look very different from IBM Watson, and that's okay, because there's no one answer to these things. But I also like to add too that I think part of the problem is we're calling these things a design system. And design is just one part of it, right? It's like these quotes you see here are trying to describe what a design system is through a design lens. But if you think about what a design system is, or it can be, what it should be, it's much more than just, quote, design. And so something that we don't have an answer for yet, but I think an opinion expressed or shared amongst all the Loupe partners is we don't think the future of design systems is that they're called design systems, that they need to be more inclusive with all of the work that goes into this. Again, we're not sure what that is just yet, but I think part of the problem with where we are with design systems is that they're still stuck in design in some way. They're still anchored to just the practice of design.
And I think the same way that we're talking about that idea of systems thinking, of both looking more broadly than our work and then looking deeply into our work and its constituent parts. I think as we discuss where are design systems going, we also need to look at, well, where are they coming from? Where are they coming? It's that kind of Rousseau, like, where have we come from? Where are we and where are we going type of thing. But in our case, I think that as content strategists, we can step back and say, well, before we were using that language of design systems, that nomenclature, were we calling this governance? Were we calling this kind of the components and laws around them and the plan for integrating the right people, bringing the right people into the process and at the right frequency, at kind of a predetermined calendar for establishing rules, seeing how people are applying or working around those rules, and then having a plan to sort of update the set of rules. And I think if we think of governance broadly like that, then there is room for design systems to live within that kind of definition.
So a question for you, and maybe all of the folks joining us, but because to me, content strategy, when it comes to the questions about seat at the table and being a part of not just design systems, but other decisions that are being made. When content strategy became a more solidified practice, I know there was a point in time where something like governance models were discussed or created, but you didn't call it that. Because I don't remember hearing about governance models at when I went to Confab, or I would read your blog post, or, I just don't remember that being there. So, and sorry, everybody, but this question just came to me is what did you call that? Because I think there's something to be learned from content strategy that can be used to help with current problems around design systems.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I would say governance is actually, before I answer that question, I just want to take a step back and say, if it seems like Greg and I are kind of like going back and forth on this was kind of by design, because we wanted to frame this presentation as more of a discussion, fireside chat, debate, because that's where we are right now in the industry and looking at how we're moving forward together. It does need to be an open conversation because we need to figure it out still. We're not in presentation mode, we're in figuring it out mode still. So we want to have this conversation in the broader community. And I think, to go back to your point, Greg, though, about governance, I think that it is something that we have been discussing for a long time, I think, in organizations of different sizes. So I think it's something that Lisa Welchman has been writing about, teaching about, evangelizing for, I'd say at least a decade, maybe 15 years, maybe more. And I think we see how her work has played out in pockets and affected many large organizations and at the government level as well. And I think that in many smaller organizations, though, governance might start out as, let's develop editorial style guidelines and an editorial calendar. And maybe that is enough, or maybe that's the most palatable form or palatable terminology that we can introduce to the rest of the company, because governance sounds expensive and it sounds sort of legalese and compliance oriented. And in some corporate cultures and some publishing cultures, that's a horrifying thing. Mm-hmm. In others, though, they welcome it. And I think that's kind of where we can start to go with the conversation around design systems. I think as we've kind of taken it further and seen, well, it's not just about component libraries and tokens and figuring out how those things go together, but really that it has a much bigger impact. That's where we're starting to talk about that good governance is something that should draw in and can benefit folks in legal, folks that address compliance, folks in customer service, in marketing, people that care about accessibility and making sure that you're not sued for having an inaccessible website. I think that when we can standardize the language, the content types, the development of different elements within a web experience, so that they are compliant and consistent. Not only are we then saying to people, well, you can focus your creativity not on reinventing those things, but on new stuff. But we're also saying that the things that you do create will be compliant, will help our organization avoid lawsuits, will best serve our users, because we're not adding that additional psychic and emotional and intellectual load on them to learn new interfaces, to learn where we're putting like the call to action every time and the language for that call to action. And I think that's really where we see the opportunity for us to go more broadly. That's that kind of systems thinking mindset, and to ensure that what is consistent in one silo can be applied across many silos too.
Yeah, I think that's where, again, in kind of putting our heads together, if we had to put our finger on a definition of what a design system is, it is core that it's an expression of the brand. And again, that's not just visual, but that's also voice, tones, the whole thing. But to make sure that there is a cohesive brand experience across products. And if Nick Hahn was here, he'd be able to jump in and tell you about work that he did at IBM, where in IBM Cloud, which is just one of many businesses within IBM around the world. In IBM Cloud, they did an audit of all of their user experiences. And even though I want to say there was like 13 or 14 bespoke experiences, even though they were using the same design system, they were all using Watson, and they were all in compliance of using Watson. But imagine if you're a cloud customer at IBM, and when you log in and jump from application to application or experience to experience, it's all different. And I should say it's 95% different. And so that's where we really believe that when we talk about compliance, it's not just like accessibility and regulatory compliance, but it's also brand compliance. It's making sure that your users have that cohesive experience across all of your experiences.
Right. And I think talking about things at scale there, I guess that's another area where I feel like in our mindset, in the content strategy mindset, we're good at that kind of fractalized thinking of saying, well, what works well here at the element level, these are the rules that allow it to expand maybe to the component or the molecule level, or whatever sort of language or metaphor, I guess, you're using around that. But that idea of moving from small to medium to big, I think that's also what allows us to say, well, are we talking about this at the level of editorial style guidelines? Are we talking about this at the level of governance policy? And also, are we talking about this within the context of a content model or a design system? Because I think there are a lot of parallels there as far as declaring the elements, declaring the rules for them, and then saying within these guidelines, now you can go be creative or focus your creativity elsewhere. It isn't needed here. And I know there was a question that had come up in the chat of like, how do we differentiate there? And I think in some cases that's where we differentiate based on the needs and the jargon of the audience to which we're proposing this, or we're trying to get that buy-in.
Language is very important.
But not absolute. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
So do you want to go through the story that we've put together? Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I think,
I want to preface this by saying, my time working with IBM and USAA, and then more importantly at Envision, that's just my own story, but with Nick and Brett and Margot, we've seen a lot of these types of initiatives, but specifically with Nick and I, we've seen this around design systems. And not just in the work that we've done, but also in the conversations that we've had with a lot of people. I think between Nick and I and our time working together at Envision, talked to hundreds of design leaders who had issues or needed help, assistance with their design system. So it's all to say we've seen a lot, and we've seen a common pattern, which is that a lot of teams, when they go to stand up their version 1, it kind of looks like this, is they spin it up, they go do some stakeholder research, they talk to stakeholders, they go to build the system, and then about a year later they launch and they give away free t-shirts and they have cake and they talk about how great this design system is. And then they say, okay, so who's going to sign up and start using the design system? Right. And even though they've talked to a lot of teams, they've talked a lot about needs, and they thought that they did the research, they leave adoption. They leave that, how are we going to get this integrated into the products and experiences? They leave that to the end. And this is like, in our industry, it's almost like the Disney movie, like the tale as old as time. And this is well documented. Like I've seen so many articles around, go ahead and get started because your first design system is just going to fail. Right? It's almost like accepted that you're going to hit a wall, and that's okay. That's kind of like you're going to earn your street cred. And when you go to design system, version 2, and I forget, Margot, if we have that slide for the next one.
Okay.
No,
I just cut ahead till it gets bad.
The next system, and you're going to get a little bit further. In other words, in design, Nick and I especially have seen like this accepted point of failure. Like just keep going. Like by your 4th or 5th time, you're going to get there. And I've seen and talked to people who have been there. They've over the years, over 3 or 4 years, they're on design system version 5 or 6, and they're still not getting adoption. In fact, if you look at IBM Watson, which is arguably one of the most mature, the most widely adopted design systems, I want to say they're on version 11 right now. At one point in IBM, there were 14 or 16 bespoke design systems across 3 different brands at IBM. And, over time, they kept hitting walls, kept failing, and they kind of started to get that down to one system. And it really wasn't until IBM launched a new brand language that Watson gained usage across all the products, all the experiences around the world, around all the companies at IBM. And they were able to do that because they worked with this brand team that was coming up with the new brand language so that they could go to all the product teams and say, hey, listen, for you to become compliant with the new brands language within IBM, use Watson. And that's where the usage just shot up. And so anyway, that's what, 11, I wouldn't call them quite, complete failures, but there was a lot of time, a lot of resources spent on getting to that success story. And so what we've seen is, and you go to the next slide, Margot, is this pattern of failure, over and over and over again at companies all over the world. So one of our thoughts here on design systems specifically is we don't believe that it has to fail. I mean, it's kind of like that idea of failing fast, which has become a bit of a cult in design and even just product at large, but we don't feel like that's necessary. And if we take a look at the patterns of failure, like why did these systems fail over time again? They didn't start with governance and adoption. They didn't include that in their earlier work. Nobody had a shared understanding of what success was going to be, so therefore couldn't be measured, right? And then they were unaware of underlying gaps within the organization, which I'm sure if you've been in content strategy for long enough, I'm sure you've seen this in your own work of these types of initiatives will expose where there are problems in the organization, within the culture, within the maturity level of the organization.
I think when we see that sort of sequential failure too, and I don't want to shy away from that terminology, because I think in many organizations that embrace the fail fast kind of mindset, they look at it as like, well, every time it gets a little bit better. But like in that example of like 11 tries, and yeah, maybe every time it gets a little bit better, it is incrementally improving, but it is also sequentially failing. And there is such a huge cost to that, not just in terms of the actual money that goes into developing the design system and hoping it gets better every time, or launching the new CMS and hoping it's better than the one before. But there's such a huge psychological cost to that, like the emotional cost to feeling like, oh God, we're still using this system that doesn't quite cut it. And I think when organizations take a different approach to it, instead by planning for a more sustainable rollout and ongoing governance and ongoing improvement process, rather than multiple rollouts where adoption is like the last thing that they think of. But when they start with the goals of governance and adoption, by starting with co-creation, by saying we're going to get it right from the beginning by not Heismaning it over to the people that need to take it on, but rather by working together to build the thing that we need from the get-go, they see incremental success, because success builds on success and people can rally around that. Also, when they're bringing people into the process from the get-go that will be using it, they can ensure that the idea of adoption isn't the big hurdle, because people can then rally around it, evangelize it to their teams, encourage its support. And like I was saying, I feel like this mirrors a lot of the things that we've started to learn, or that we have learned in content strategy. I think back to like my own experience with developing editorial style guidelines, like 10, 15 years ago, even further back, doing them for clients. I would work from the message architecture. I would kind of look to see, well, are they more about AP style or more about Chicago manual, because they're good, kind, and smart people. And where are we going with title case versus sentence case, et cetera. And I would put together an editorial style guide and present it to like the internal team of copywriters, and then walk on out of there. And as you can probably imagine, maybe you did that once too, it wasn't great. I mean, maybe they looked at me as like the outside consultant that knows things, but I I was kind of hoping that they would adopt it and it wouldn't become yet another failed system that sat on a shelf. And when I took the approach instead of rather than kind of flinging it over the wall, a la consulting in like 2005, instead, when I took the approach of gathering all the copywriters in the room to say, all right, these are the topics that we need to hit in your editorial style guidelines. Let's discuss what you're doing now. Let's find out, like, why does PR do one thing and then the marketing department do something else? Why are we taking different approaches to if you're using the Oxford comma or not? Is it because some of you are not good, kind, smart people? When we had those open conversations and they could hear our recommendations, when they could hear from each other across the table, it meant then that everybody leaving the room knew why I was advocating for certain approaches. They knew why things were fitting together with their message architecture, and then how to rally around those goals and share them with the rest of their team, so that when I went away then and documented that conversation and created editorial style guidelines based on it, they could run with it. I didn't have to hope and pray that they would adopt it because they had been a part of the creation process. And I think that we're seeing like the same thing play out now in successful design systems, especially in successful design systems that embrace content strategy from day one. There was a question I saw in chat of like asking, well, how does this happen in parallel? Where does content strategy fit in? I had the opportunity to work with Mailchimp a year or two ago on their content strategy and design system, where content strategy was part of the design system from the get-go. They'd been using other kind of smaller design systems that didn't totally affect everything that they wanted to within the organization. But by building in the components to say that this is what headlines look like, and this is how headlines will work from an editorial style and tone perspective, it meant that as those components were evolving, nobody was just applying content to them later on or applying design to existing copy and kind of hoping it would work or having those conversations. We had those conversations as part of the development of the design system. So it allowed the people that were shaping the design system to bring more of the right people into the room from day one, that were copywriters and content designers, visual designers, content strategists, to make sure that the right perspectives were included so that there were fewer edge cases, fewer needs for exceptions or needs to deviate from the system. And by adopting that kind of more inclusive approach, they were able to achieve greater compliance, because now there were, as I said, there were fewer needs to work around the system or just kind of say, well, this is a separate project. We don't have to follow the rules. Turned out that was a hit for designers. It was a hit for the editors that would be reviewing content to make sure it was compliant. It was also a big win for HR and legal and anybody that wanted to make sure that if they were measuring the results of a project, that they knew what standards they needed to hit from the get-go. So I feel like that's like the ideal case for us to work together, by having those conversations when we're figuring out the systems rather than when we're testing it against content in projects that we hope will kind of fit into it. Kind of ensures greater compliance from that starting point.
So you talk about and I saw that in the chat there was like wanting the seat at the table. You talk about having the conversations. I would push to elevate that to be, you don't want to just have conversations with designers and vice versa, or the folks working on the design system. You want to be in there collaborating, right? You want to be in there not necessarily sitting next to them while they're designing a thing or coding a thing, but when they're ideating around what is the thing, the component, the feature that needs to be created, you all should be in the room, and vice versa. I would also say too is, in this work, you don't want to sit at the table. I would push for you to go get a position in front of the whiteboard, right? That you're there creating these things. And I don't mean just like the making of things, but that your voice, your work is also represented in whatever you want to call it, the governance, the process, the the rules of how you all work together, but that it's one, you're pushing for that to be collaborative, not just so that it's just a different way for you to be looking at the work and, kind of checking a box or redlining and asking for changes to be made, but that in those moments where decisions are being made, you and your other partners that might be in marketing, in legal, and other departments that are, might be considered fringe to the actual making of a design system, you should be in there with them, helping to think through what is to be made and how it should be made, how it should be maintained, how it should be evolved, right? And another part of this, I saw a question in chat about what's the difference between a model and a system. A model is an idea for how you might get things done, right? It's like, to me, like a different version of a method. The system is when you've taken and run through that model and come up with what that system is going to be for you. And the system in this case for design is not only goes back to that one slide, not only just like the components and the design files, and even in this case, the language, but also what's the contribution model? How can you as a content strategist, how can you work with others or even just work by yourself and contribute to the future of the design system? Because if Nick was here, he'd be kind of shouting at this right now. He'd say, a design system without a contribution model is not a system at all. Because the intent of these things is that they could scale beyond just what one team can create, and just beyond, especially with what one design or engineering or product team can create. This should be something that anybody in the company can contribute to, and or I should say submit ideas for contributions to the design system.
I think I saw Cyrilia say that accepting that something like a style guide should be iterative helped me overcome some perfectionist procrastination. And a couple other people said, yeah, living document or living guide. And yeah, I think taking that, both that mindset that this is a thing that will grow and change, or at least grow iteratively, and kind of declaring that from the beginning is, it sets you up for that. And then I think there's the vision, but now also saying tactically, here's how we're going to do it. I would love to see every time we commit something, every time we publish something, every time we say we're rolling out the new design system, that the second half of that sentence or announcement says, and we will be revisiting this every 6 months, or we'll be taking new additions to it. Or do you have, did you encounter something where a component didn't exist, or you realized something was missing from it? Here's how you get in touch with the people that kind of manage this process. We'll be collecting new additions over this time period and every 3 months reviewing them so that people know that and this is where we get into a weird we versus they thing, but so that the users of the system know that they are consumers of the system as well as creators of the system, and that it's on all of us to make it better. I feel like I'm talking about democracy now too, and this is why you should vote. But yeah, you need to be involved in saying hey, here's what I felt was missing from this system that was created with and for and hopefully by me as well. But I always get a little twitchy when I feel like we're in a space, either if I'm in a space as a speaker or I'm hearing somebody on a stage that's like, you should do this. Because I feel like for most of us in the room, we're like, yeah, we know how. How do we do this? I want to share some examples of how you start brokering those conversations. And I think, as with the design system, if anything is missing, please raise your voice so that we can include it next time around. I would love to hear what works for other people too, because we're at a tough point right now in the economy, certainly in a lot of companies that have been having layoffs, where we see that, Greg, I think you phrased it the other day, that fewer people need to do more. AI is one of those ways that we can automate things so that fewer people are able to do more. Or we develop systems that actually work for us as well, so that fewer people can still maintain consistency, that people can come into the room and be able to give appropriate feedback on something without even necessarily having been a part of the thing from the very beginning, because they can see where it's come from and where it's going. One of the things that I've found helps whenever I'm trying to sell the idea of like, hey, I need a seat at the table, or I need to be in that room having that discussion, is by tying it back to the money. It's that kind of like follow the money type of thing. When I point out that compliance with a content strategy system, compliance with editorial style guidelines, or compliance with the design system will save an organization money, because we will have fewer review cycles and content creators will get it right the first time without getting back a bunch of like nasty feedback on it. That usually has it builds a lot of morale with people that are creating content, because nobody really likes getting that kind of feedback. And whoever holds the purse strings also tends to value that, because they see fewer review cycles, and we're lowering the opportunity to get audited or to get sued. This is a great thing when it comes to our budget. Craig, what's your take on that? What do you find works for selling the bring us into the room argument?
Yeah, if you want to visualize the problems that you have, get a cross-functional team in the room. And what I mean by that is, get your designers, engineers, your product people, maybe your project managers, get someone for marketing, content, compliance, get them in there and have each of them map out, how do you think we go from an idea to a shipped component? Just map it out. What are the steps? Who's involved? I guarantee you, and I say this because I've seen this time and time again, it's never failed. You get enough people in the room, and it doesn't take much. It can be as little as 6 to as many as 40. But you get those folks in the room and have them map out what they think is going on, and I guarantee you, you're going to find some problems. You're going to find some gaps, and you're going to find some overlaps. You're going to find where there's people do not have the same definition of the same, not just the process, but even like what words mean. What does done mean? Right? When are you finished? When do I need to pick it up? Or when do we need to collaborate? Then if you also map in who's responsible for getting these different things done, just wildly different definitions, right, across all of your practices. And if you put those teams together, you'll find that even in smaller teams, they have different definitions of what all that looks like. And the real magic comes in is once you've exposed what the gaps and overlaps are, and then you start to realize how inefficient things are, right? And that there might even be, I had a problem at USA where I had 2 teams that were almost at fisticuffs. I mean, they could not work together without wanting to just punch each other. And I brought them in a room and I said, you draw out what you think is going on, in working together, and you design team, you do the same. And then they're just like, oh, light bulb moment. Like this entire time we had no idea that the design team was taking all the work that another group was doing and kind of just throwing it away, saying, thank you very much, design's here, you're welcome. We'll redo the entire process and get the work done the way it's supposed to. There was no communication that these 2 groups had very different processes for trying to get the same work done. They didn't identify like who's responsible for what type of work and who needs to play to the strengths of the other team. They just hadn't had this conversation. And within one afternoon, it didn't take a lot of time, within 4 hours, we had a new understanding of where we were bumping heads, where we didn't have the trust. Like we had, I don't know what antitrust is called, but that's where the teams were. And then from that point on, we were able to get the teams back together and to co-create a new process. And in doing so, that became the new model for how other teams within all of USA, 35,000 employees, 50 product teams, how they should be doing work with their different partners. So that's the beauty of this is you wanted to look at how content strategy can be involved in design. And I said this to Margot a couple days ago. To me, you have seen these problems firsthand a good 10 years before design started going in-house, right? Content strategist, whether you were in-house or even as a consultant, you saw these problems firsthand. You've been having to do this work a good 10 years ahead of the design leaders. So if you want to be involved in this and learn how does this content strategy be integrated in design, I think there's an opportunity here for content strategists to go be partners with their design leaders, help them understand the parallels to the journey, the struggle here, and likely that you have diplomatic skills that your design leaders don't have, or more importantly, they might have them, but they don't want to practice them. A lot of design leaders that I've seen, again, across all these programs, both small teams to large enterprise, they'd rather focus on the work. They'd rather focus their time down than up and sideways. And it's a maturity thing. It's not and I don't mean a personal maturity thing, but just a program maturity thing. And I think that that's definitely a way that you can become best friends, good friends with your design leaders and maybe even your engineering leaders, is helping them with those skills, helping them with that type of work, because that's the kind of work that they shy away from time and time again. That's why we're in this mess, right? Like why we are where we are as design and with design systems.
I think while we're talking about those sort of parallel leaders, parallel organizations, I guess parallel groups within your organization, the other thing that I've found helps with selling this kind of approach, selling this thinking, is that it helps with how we get feedback. And I know, like when I'm presenting feedback or when I'm presenting documentation or like a message architecture or something to a client, I always couch it in, here's how we got here. You may remember our conversation from last time. Coming out of this, here's where we'll be going. In other words, these will be the impact of your feedback, your decisions today. And now today, this is the kind of feedback I'm looking for. These are the questions I want you to ask as you review this. And couching their or I guess telling them what kind of feedback I need to get ensures that our time together is fruitful and not wasted. And also it gives them that sense of self-confidence that they know how to be valuable in the process. And that's something that we all need. That's a core part of how we build trust with our clients. And I think that sort of approach applies here, in that by bringing content strategy into the design system and sort of setting standards, like defining what these different components should look and sound like, defining like the editorial style guidelines for different components, and then how they relate to each other, kind of adopting that systems thinking mindset, and then saying these are the standards that they need to meet. It helps ensure that people can give feedback across the process and kind of follow the thread from inception through all the different handoffs, different people that might be touching different parts of the system along the way, or different parts of the designed experience along the way, so that those handoffs are a lot easier, because everybody knows, oh, this particular component that I'm looking at, or the way we're applying it in this maybe website experience, these are the standards that it should be hitting. This is how we evaluate if it's good or good enough, or if it simply misses the mark, but it's really cool looking. It ensures that process is faster and more efficient, and we're not having to tell people along the way, here's what it needs to do. So I think there's that opportunity in there as well.
But having that shared definition, that shared language, and that shared understanding what those words means, that also is going to get more out of people, right? Because they know how to engage. One of the biggest problems with design is you pull in stakeholders into critiques, and in the absence of saying, this is what we're reviewing, and this is the kind of feedback we need, and making sure that everybody understands what that means, that's where designers are going to get the types of responses that they hate. Make the logo bigger, move the button, make the button orange, like these standard things, because as much as designers think that they're good communicators, that we've made things so simple because it's design. We make things so hard for people because we as a group, I don't think know how to communicate very well, right? We make, like everybody, we make a lot of assumptions, and we don't use our own tools and our own work to make things easier for, quote, our users or our partners, by trying to understand the language they use and tying that to the language we use to get things together. And so, that's another thing is, content strategists, you are experts at language. That is part of your expertise. It's part of your, like, what's in you. And just know that designers everybody in the team needs that help of developing a common language. A workshop that I used to do at Envision, I think Nick did the same, is we would help design leaders bring the partners in the room together and go through a collaborative exercise to come out with a governance model. And one of the first things we did out of the gate was we had them work on specific language. This is the word I use. What is the word that you use for a similar meaning? And just have them spend an hour on not just trying to come up with that shared language, but exposing the problems of not having that shared language, right? To illustrate the need for that before you can get anything else done. And to me, this is where I feel like you all, and the work that you do, the expertise that you have, this is your superpower. And this is, again, something that your product people likely don't have an understanding of how important that language is to collaboration, and especially in setting up something like design systems and the governance around design systems.
Yeah. I think maybe this is a good point to also talk about how we've been getting feedback on this type of work. So as Paula had mentioned early on, we do still each do our own separate things. I'm still working as Appropriate Inc. But then coming together in Loupe Collective, when we've been kind of putting together our ideas around design systems consulting and realizing that maybe design systems are the shiny new Trojan horse to be talking about governance. But as we're bringing together our thinking on that, we've been doing a lot of the stuff that I think on a macro level also works at a more micro level in organizations, of putting together our ideas in a deck and then kind of bringing it out to different people that are stakeholders in this space that maybe could be potential clients, I don't know, but are also other practitioners in this space. And some of the feedback that we're asking for is, does this resonate with you? Are you seeing similar problems? How do you describe these problems? Which is really saying, what are your words for this? So that's like the input to say, how do I mirror your body language? Which, yeah, it's a little harder over Zoom, but where everybody's a little max headroomy. But still, how do we establish empathy and rapport by speaking the same language, using the same words? Because at the end of the day, that's what's going to make all the rest of their feedback more fruitful. And we in the last 6 weeks have looked for people who don't resemble us, both as people and as our professions. So seeking perspectives and points of view from all levels of leadership and all types of different, I'd say, jobs or roles within the company. Yeah, because at the end of the day, like
everything here about design systems, right? It's the same kind of conversation.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, it isn't design systems that need this help or will buy this sort of assistance into their company. It's copywriters and content designers and CMOs and chief creative officers and chief compliance officers, and increasingly folks in HR and people that care about accessibility. And this way of thinking will be successful if people can hear a bit about it and not feel overwhelmed, but rather feel confident enough in their own knowledge that they can have a conversation with content strategists, with people like all of us. I mean, I think that's part of how we build trust, by ensuring that they can trust themselves, that they feel equipped to engage with us. And I think that's, for 20 years, that has been like the challenge in content strategy. Organizations adopt content strategy and the thinking behind it when they feel confident enough to do so. And that education is on us to first build that emotional connection so that we have permission to then educate. Paul, I see you nodding on that. I know both of us in kind of our practices in the program in which we teach. I know for me, a lot of the conversations that I have with students that are coming into content strategy are around not just how you do this work, because you can learn how to do a content audit. I don't want to say pretty easily, but people can learn how to do content audits. The bigger challenge is, how do you advocate that you need to do a content audit? How do you present the results from it in a way that is actionable to your client? How do you make your client care about it and say, oh yeah, that is something we should reinvest in every year, every 6 months on an ongoing basis, so it is a sustainable practice. So yeah, it's not the technique, it's the people.
Well, exactly. And part of that is even, and you've talked about this too, obviously, just tonight, the sort of upfront work of, actually assessing, is the organization ready to do this? I mean, how open, how open are people to having these conversations? How ready would they be to take action based on what you find? So yeah, I've come to, definitely, as you're saying, I mean, my own emphasis, and to anyone who doesn't know, I'm kind of focused on content audits as a topic, really spending more time thinking about the planning, the preparation, the organizational readiness, and then, as you say, I mean, the audit's a process. You can learn that bit, but if you don't have the buy-in from the organization, if you don't have, an intent and a motivation to actually take action on what you find, then it's not, you're not likely to be very successful, let alone then incorporate all that into your governance. So
you
sorry to jump in, but
auditing, and you talk about auditing content, right? And properties, but in this step of like governance, there's also the auditing of what is the company culture. And you talk about what's the readiness? Are they going to accept this? Yes, no. And that's the work that I'm doing right now, is researching in like, what can you identify? Is it possible that you have culture types, right? That then you can take a look at that and say, where I'm working now, or my client's culture, do they map to any of these archetypes? And then if so, what might be a playbook for how to assess, one, if they're ready, and if they're not, what are steps to make this more viable? I think that's like a next part of work that we're looking to do as a part of the work that we're doing now, just because it's so important that if you, and I say this because I worked at IBM USAA. I was on the design transformation team at Envision. And as you all know, and I'm sure have seen, transformation, design-led transformation, whatever you want to call it, but that was a thing, from 2015 on. Harvard Business Review said, you need design-led transformation, go build a design program, and they're just going to put this in a box and give it to you. And at IBM, and for sure at USAA, there was so much pushback on that because the culture wasn't ready for us, and we weren't ready for the culture, right? And there's different stories in there that I'm happy to share someday, but especially at USAA, a culture that was 100 years old, hadn't really changed very much at all. We came in as the shiny new object, and it did not go well. And I left before it really didn't go well, but you need to have that study. Again, this is something where I think content strategists can come in and help use those auditing skills, not on components and things like that, but just what are the relationships we need to have? What are shared goals? How can we find a way where all of the goals that each of these individuals have for the year, how might that map to the success of a design system, right? These again are, I think, diplomatic skills that you all have because you've had to build them up over time, because you likely had a lot less funding than, say, a design program. That's not lost on me. Hundreds of designers being hired, and yet there's maybe, I don't know, a handful of content strategists in the same organization.
Yes, those are fun times.
Yeah,
I think that idea though of looking at publishing culture, just to get back at kind of like the how does content strategy fit into design systems work, I think we are able to best positioned to facilitate those conversations, whether it's sitting with the designers on the team and pushing back and saying, these are all great ideas, but how are they going to go over, run that up the flagpole, see who salutes. I think we're in a good position as advocates for users, kind of wearing that hat, advocates for the brand of considering like brand voice and seeing what is sustainable, but also we are typically the people that are saying, well, what content types are right for this company to produce? And okay, maybe we've had a blog for a long time, but does anybody actually read the blog? Is it a valuable content type? And then also, well, we could recommend that we have, I don't know, like video interviews posted all over our site, but does that mesh with our publishing culture? Do we have people that can do that? Do we have people that like to do that? Can we set an editorial calendar around that? Is that going to be right for us? Or should we really be creating more like short form content and quick get over to Twitter or something? I think we are in the right position to say what will work for us. And even without prescribing editorial style guidelines or voice and tone guidelines for content types, being in that position of saying, well, what will work for us? How do we currently review content? Is it kind of a more top-down type of thing? Do we have a very like waterfall model of people commissioning content, other people writing it, other people reviewing it, and then it goes to legal? Like, what is our process like? Are things more federated, where maybe there's a central team that is pushing out editorial style guidelines, but then they're applied in different ways within each of the colleges in our university or in each of the departments within our company? Or do we have more decision by committee? We are the people that are in the right position to evaluate how that works at the present moment and how it should work moving forward. And I think that we can be a good advocate for content creators within an organization in that capacity. So I think there's real value in selling that too, to a team that, especially if it's a design-led design systems team, of kind of selling that, because it will ultimately make their work that much more successful. And again, it isn't waiting until the end to think about adoption, but figuring out from the beginning what will make this right in our culture, and then how do we plan for governance for a sustainable, ongoing kind of effort.
Hear, hear. Like maybe a great place to see if I know, Ariel, you've been watching the chat, and just see if there were any other comments or questions that maybe haven't been addressed. I know Margot and Greg, you've been good at kind of keeping an eye on what's there, but wondering if there's anything else we can surface from there.
I feel like most everything has been addressed. The one I'm gonna just jump in on a personal note. One thing that comes up in my work is people balk at rules, and I want to discuss that just a little bit. Like how do we communicate that these rules actually build freedom for folks? Because you talk about compliance with the design system, and people are like, oh yeah, I got to go use the design system components, and I'm restricted by using these design system components. And sometimes you get that reaction. And what's your experience then with regard to getting people to be like, no, actually, this is a really good, healthy thing for me?
That's a I wish I had an answer to that did not sound quite so capitalist, but I think that it goes back to money. It goes back to money and time as well as emotional capital. I'll say it like that. I think when you can demonstrate to people, let me rephrase. I think what we need to do is demonstrate to people that they can get their work published or approved that much faster, and that their work will be rewarded and applauded if it is consistent with the previously approved rules. That's, I think, the path to success, both for whatever system of rules that we've created, again, whether it's like editorial style guidelines or a larger design system or some other kind of governance model. I think that it is a path to success for that system and helps other people rally around the system so that it is a sustainable and ongoing thing. And it's also a path to success for those individuals. So what I've seen, for example, is that in some organizations, like at every like quarterly meeting, internal or something like that, they will salute like the microsite that launched most successfully that quarter, or a particular event, or sometimes it'll be like, and here's like the blog post that got the greatest number of hits, or here's like our social media thing that got the greatest number of hits. And by design, they are calling out events or posts or microsites that played within the rules. Some of that, I think, is kind of a conscious thing of saying, let's elevate the things that did best within our existing system. But other things are kind of the result of a kind of like web-based natural selection to say, hey, look, we said you needed to use these keywords. You used these keywords. So shockingly, you did really well in the search results. Some of this is like you play by the rules and the rules will treat you well. So I think that there's that kind of opportunity to say, work within this and you will see these rewards if those rewards are valuable to the people on your team. And sometimes it can be as much as like, look, if you're using this with Writer, with our kind of like preferred lexicon or some other tool that's going to like check to make sure that you're using our keywords and our phrasing, pre-approved spellings and capitalization on those things. If you follow those rules, you're not going to get dinged by the system. Don't you want that?
I have something to add to Margot's kind of carrot, and then I've got a stick approach too. So one of the early conversations we had this year was with Todd Wilkins, who is the Chief Product Officer at Remote. And we had him take a look at the work that we were doing and just tell it to us like it is. And we got talking about design systems and the benefits, and kind of just to that question of, it's a constraint, right? It's like you're taking all the creativity out of my work. I'm not a designer now. I'm just putting Lego pieces together. And Todd's perspective as a chief product officer was like, that's great. I love it, because the design system is to some degree like all the low hanging fruit, like the stuff that designers shouldn't want to be doing day to day. And a design system should then enable them to go do the more interesting work, which is to go do the research, to go find like what's next, right? And doing that work. And so that to me is like part of the carrot here of like, you don't want to be designing landing pages for the rest of your career, do you? There's some of this work, like, do you really want to be doing that for the next 5 years? Wouldn't you rather evolve as a designer and go do this other work that leads to more innovation, leads to improving people's lives? So that's the carrot. The stick answer I have for you is, right before we got on, I saw a video a guy posted. He has access to GPT Chat 4. And GPT Chat 4 recognizes you can draw things, you can give it an image, and it will do things with the image. In this case, the guy drew a website on a napkin, no joke, scanned it, showed it to GPT 4, and I don't know how long it took him, but it was just, boom, here's your web page. Now, it wasn't very good looking web page, but we're still very, very, very early days in AI. And so when it comes to doing a lot of the type of work that goes into design systems, I hate to say it, but as designers, as creatives, there's some amount of work that we're just going to need to do really well, because someday it's likely that a machine is going to be doing some of that for us.
Yeah.
And so the stick is, yeah, you don't want to be doing that work anyway. Do a really good job at it. Learn how to incorporate AI into doing that type of work and within the constraints, and then go learn skills that enables you to become a different kind of designer that's really going to be of use to companies down the road.
I think the analog for that in content too is that ChatGPT or some other machine learning writing assistant or content generator can crank out the basic, the boring, the commonplace and common denominator stuff. And in some contexts, for some clients, some brands, that is enough. That will be enough. So let's save ourselves for the creative stuff that should be in the more compelling context, like the homepage value proposition copy, the product descriptions, or the organizations that are like, I don't want the run-of-the-mill error message. Our brand is quirky enough. We want to be the really fabulously memorable error messages. We want to be like the 404 pages that everybody shares. So and the opt-out language at the bottom of an email that everybody wants to save. Let's do that. And those will be the organizations that want more because they want us. They want the human writers. I just want to also go back to talk more tactically about, there was the question around where content guidelines live in relationship to design guidelines. I don't want to move past that. What I have found works best, I will quote Erin Kassane on this. She said, I think in a content strategy New England meetup like 12 years ago, I heard her say, keep your tools where you use them, which means, yes, maybe you document things off in an editorial style guide, and that's where they live. That's where you update them every 6 months. That's where like there's the, editorial style guidelines at, yourdomain.com where people can send in requests. But then when you've got like the part of your design system that is for creating headers or for creating like body copy blocks, if you've got the design guidelines there, the content guidelines that apply to that component should live there as well. They can draw from some other centralized database or repository, but let them live there. If there needs to be an explanation of why are we using this, or does it need to say next to it, this, make sure you're writing this in title case or do this in sentence case. Why do we do things in sentence case? Maybe you need to have that sort of ancillary instructional copy there as well. It can live there, but keep your tools where you use them. Let the guidelines live next to the components to which they apply, even if they're sort of calling home in some other kind of external document or database or something like that. Thinking that's also the way it plays out best, like in a content management system. I remember several years ago, I worked with Al Jazeera America when they were launching in the US, creating an American version of Al Jazeera. And we were developing their content management system. And I think that was the first place where I said, if we're designing these components, let's also be editorializing these. Let's also content strategize these components, and let's have our guidelines live next to the sort of visual guidelines for it as well. So for that, I created, there was a standalone editorial style guide that pulled into an elements description doc that was one half of the content model. So the content model comprised relationship diagrams for each of the content types that showed how they all fit together, or how all the different elements fit together within that content type. And then the elements description doc said that, okay, for this element, its maximum character count is this. It needs to start with this part of speech, or it's this sort of free select field, something like that. So those two things lived outside the system, but the system then drew them in. And that's also what the developers were using to make sure that they were creating the right fields in the back end of the CMS, the right types of fields for it. I think it works the same way now. We can apply that same thinking and keep it where we should keep our tools where we use them, but also where they will be most useful for the people that need to learn from them too.
Yeah. Well said. That's exactly the battle that I'm jumping on in my work right now, is making sure the tools are available where people use them. I think that's like the tweet of the night.
So there was another little kind of theme in the chat about working with engineering, and I wonder if you could say a little bit about that. Jared, for example, had a post there about working from containers backward, versus from content forward. And I think, I know that I've experienced that, coming in as the content strategist, after things have been designed and having to sort of reverse engineer content to work in a design that's already been not only kind of codified, but literally, built into a system. And I'm wondering if either of you have any sort of tips for the people in the group who also work with the engineers who are literally building these systems into content management systems, for example.
I did some research for a design system tool last summer, and I talked to mostly engineers, funny enough, because this particular tool was created for use mostly with the Drupal world, right? So you're kind of like engineering led there, kind of off the bat. Anyway, what I found interesting is that the chief technology officer that I talked to and a couple of the engineering directors I talked to, they were the ones that were trying to get design systems established in their companies, not just for the efficiency part, but also to get their designers to think more systems like, because their designers kept just knocking out bespoke types of things, pages and experiences. And so it was, what I found fascinating, it was definitely a surprise kind of insight from that research, is I think you'll find that just as you're thinking about content strategy and systems and trying to come up with that systematic approach to things, is very likely your engineering partners are thinking the same way, right? And so then you're kind of like approaching them on both sides of trying to get the designers over the need to create bespoke designed everything, but also to hear it from two different partners, two different sides. So if that's all to say, if your designers are having, if you're struggling in working with them, go make partners, go form an allegiance with your engineering people and work on that together, because I think you'll find some fans of that approach and some very much some supporters of that type of thinking.
Nice. Excellent.
Oh, Paul, it looks like you're talking, but you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was just going to say we're kind of coming up on our time here. If anyone has one last burning question, drop it in the chat. But if not, definitely just want to thank Margot and Greg. It's been a really interesting conversation.
What a great conversation.
Lots of great conversation going on in the chat as well. So thank you everybody for your participation. We'd love to, as I mentioned before, we'd love to see you at another event or join us on Slack. Sort of keep the conversation going. Appreciate your showing up.
And buy a fancy t-shirt.
Yes, buy a t-shirt.
Thank you all.
Awesome. Thanks to everybody who showed up tonight. And thanks, Margot and Greg. You guys, just that conversation is so spicy and I love it.
Awesome.
Thank you all so much.